Hi there, everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by CA Quadrant Academy and Training. My name is Masim Ali, and I will be hosting this webinar, which is on internal control. So, as always, I like to start off with a motivational quote, and this is just to keep the motivational levels up. I know that you guys have written UNISA's test 2 this week. And from the general consensus which I'm seeing, it was a bit of a challenging test. There have been some people who really seemed quite despondent about it. And look, I can sympathize. I mean, I was there before. I know how it feels. You study your heart out, and sometimes you just get into the test, and it's just a nightmare. And it's easy to lose motivation. When things like that happen, it's easy to really feel down about yourself, to start doubting whether you actually have the ability to pass, to start doubting whether this is the right career for you. And look, that's normal, but at the same time, that's not a healthy mindset to have. If you want to be successful at this course, anybody who has passed it will tell you that you need to believe that you can pass. So you need to remain positive. You need to remain motivated. You need to remain, excited about the prospect of passing, even though it may not look like you've got any hope right now. And to be honest with you, I don't think any of you should be feeling that way right now. It is very possible for you to still make the year. It is, these stumbling blocks happen, and it's part of learning. But just use the opportunity to do exactly that, to learn. So the quotation which I have here is, or it says as follows, it reads as follows: "Don't wish it were easier, wish that you were better." Right? And this is something which is very applicable to your CTA year, right? A lot of people feel that somehow miraculously it's going to become easier as the year goes by, or that it gets easier from year to year. And then there's a lot of people who really disagree with that statement and will say that no, it does not get easier as the year goes by. It doesn't get easier year by year. In fact, some people might feel it gets even worse. To be honest with you, no, it doesn't get easier. If people have told you that, I'm sorry, I have to disagree with it, right? What happens is that you just get better at this course, right? So from doing it once where you're not sure about anything, where you're really, really just now learning about how to manage the workload, what the testing is like, all those sort of things. You're trying to navigate through all of that. And sometimes, look, you come up short. When you try it for the second time, you've already done that groundwork. So you're not spending time and effort trying to figure that out. And you can sort of, you've got some embedded knowledge which you just build on. So it's more of a case of you just getting better at it rather than the course becoming easier. I promise you there's not going to be some sort of scenario where, the level of the scores is just going to drop and people are just going to start passing it left, right, and center. This is a difficult course, and it's very likely that you knew that before you started it. And with that said, it should tell you something that not everybody can pass it, and that it's something which a lot of people struggle with. And if it were easy, then everybody would have it, and its value or its worth would diminish somewhat, don't you think? So that's why it's very important that you don't allow the course to beat you. You can get better at it, but don't wait for the course to get easier, right? Take the approach of you getting better. Take the approach of you upping your game rather than, a test just becoming easier, the lecturers deciding to have mercy. We as students always like to sort of joke around with that. But don't wait for any of those sort of things, right? You're just wasting your time if you're expecting the course to change. the cause is not going to change. If anything, it will probably get harder. All right, as more and more legislation becomes applicable. So, I would say become better yourself. And that's something which you need to do, right? Looking at the agenda, just some administration issues that we'll touch on. Then the internal control, which is the core of our program for today. Exam technique, very, very, very important. Anybody who has passed and any lecturer will tell you that irrespective of how well you may know your work, if you cannot apply it in the exam, you're doomed. So exam technique, and this is something which I learned from personal experience, right? Exam technique can literally make the difference between you passing and failing. So I would really suggest, and I always incorporate these into my webinars, right? That you do always spend some time focusing on exam technique. Whenever you study any section, make sure that you do dedicate some time to focusing on exam technique and improving your current exam technique. There's always room for improvement. So make sure that where you can improve, you do improve. Other questions? Well, if you do have any queries, once, regarding the content of this webinar, once this webinar has run its course and is complete, you are more than welcome to contact us via our Facebook page or to email us, right? We do have a Facebook page. A lot of you would be very familiar with it. And we do encourage a lot of interaction on that page, right? So it's not just a page to keep us visible on Facebook. We do encourage you to, get into contact with us, get in touch with us, let us know, about anything that is, you might be struggling with. And as part of your purchase of this webinar, you've gotten unlimited, consultations until test 3. So use them, right? And unlimited consultations on internal control, right? So if you do have any internal control related questions, please do contact us. We are available to assist, and we expect that you will take advantage of this opportunity which we are giving you to liaise with us, right? So moving on to the administration issues, right, or the administrative issues. If you are experiencing any connection problems, sound problems, technical difficulties resulting in the webinar being unable to continue, please, please, please get into contact with us, and we will try and assist you and arrange some other method or some other way to make the webinar accessible to you. You've paid for this webinar, and even if it was free, actually, just by showing interest in this webinar, just by showing interest in trying to improve, we would want to help you, and we want to make this webinar accessible to you. So if for any reason it is not accessible to you and you can't access it, please get into contact with us. Technology is a funny thing. It has its moments where it does cause difficulties, but there are ways around it, right? So it's not like we're going to say, oh no, well, there was a technological glitch and now, it's over and we can't do anything now. There's no such thing as that. So if you do experience any problems, please do let us know. Please get into contact with us and let us know, right? Questions during the session, pretty much, if you have any questions, please email them to us or get into contact with us via our Facebook page, and we'll respond to you. I mean, it's pretty simple, right? Tutorial webcast. We do want to start a series of tutorial webcasts whereby we actually go into a question in a bit more detail and sort of drill down to actually understand which are the principles which are being tested and to help you identify these principles. A common perception which we've noticed is that students seem to think that, okay, fine, if I've done 10 questions on a particular topic, by virtue of me doing these 10 questions, I am prepared for this topic. because, I've done those 10 questions. So I've done the questions, and therefore it means that I'm ready to be examined on the topic. And that is not true. The purpose of the question is to firstly, test the application of the theory which you have studied, to work on some exam technique, improve your timing, to improve how you identify issues, to really get your application of the theory up to scratch. But you are expected to be able to identify the principles and to apply these principles. And if you are struggling with that, then even if you've done 10 questions, or if you've done 30 questions, but you still cannot apply the principle, you are still going to experience problems. So this is the point of the tutorial webcast, right? So we're not expecting you to go over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions. Chances are you don't have the time for that. So obviously, every question which you do, the idea and the goal would be to take as much out from it as possible. And that's the point of the tutorial webcast. We do have your email addresses, so we will be in contact with you guys, but we will also put it up on our Facebook page. So just keep an eye out for that in the coming few weeks, right? So moving on to the scope of the webinar. So you will notice the specific outcomes on this page, and they are quite a bit, right? So this is quite a bit of detail which we are looking at into internal control. And the reason for this is because internal control is a very important topic which I feel is very underrated, and which a lot of students don't quite give enough attention to. And if you really think about it, I mean, some people might disagree with that, but just looking at the specific outcomes on my page or on the slide, how many of you really can answer any of these? How many of you can actually say that you know and understand the definition of internal control, or that you know and understand what the role and purpose of internal control is, the components of internal control, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through each of these outcomes, but just have a look at the slide and tell me that you confidently understand most of these, even if not all. Ideally, you should actually know all of these things, but at least most of these things. And I'm pretty sure that most of you do not know it to the level which you should be knowing it. And that isn't meant to sort of insult or to undermine anybody's knowledge. It is just, a fact, right? Students don't know the internal control as well as they should. A lot of students feel that this is an undergrad topic, so if you are postgrad, you don't need to know it. And that's not true, because the basis for anything which you learn in postgrad comes from your undergrad. And one of the reasons which a lot of you might be struggling is because your basis coming from undergrad might not be exactly where it needs to be. But look, if that's the case, fine. It's not just doom and gloom. We can do something about it. And that's the whole point of this webinar, right? So don't beat yourself up about it, but just make sure that you do take this section seriously, and that you actually do take corrective action if there are certain areas which you know you are weak in and which you do not understand. Okay, moving on. We've outlined a suggested study approach for this section. Now, I just want to point out that this is a suggested study approach. So we are by no means saying that follow this and nothing else. If you have a method that's working for you, then by all means stick with it. You can try and enhance your method. If anything here on our slide you feel might be relevant to you and might help you, by all means. But if you actually find yourself drowning in the theory and you're not sure where to get started, and the section is quite hazy and a bit overwhelming at the moment, then I think that the study approach will be of quite a bit of benefit to you, and it'll really give you the starting point which you need. What I have noticed is sometimes students put off studying because they just don't know where to start studying, and that's understandable actually. I can't be hard on you for that because it is overwhelming. So when something is overwhelming, sometimes we tend to make it seem a bit worse than it really is. But at the same time, we do get, really, really, really afraid or frightened by it. And that does tend to have an impact on the way we actually to approach the section. So I think this would be a very relevant way or a very useful way to approach the section. So I would suggest that if you don't have any study approach, that you do follow this, and that you can even use this to improve on any study approach which you do currently have. Okay. Moving on to the next slide, looking at the relevant statements, right? Now, I like to know which statements are relevant to the topic at hand, right? And this is so that when you're highlighting, you know where to start and what to look at. And during the exam or any assessment, if you hit a bit of a dead end, if I can use that phrase, then you know where to revert to. You are allowed to take your handbooks into the exam with you, right? So logically, it makes sense that you know how to use these, because if you don't, then you're just getting extra weight for nothing. And why do you want to do that? So you are allowed to take it into the exam with you, and make sure that you can capitalize on this. So for me, these three statements are the most relevant statements when it comes to internal control. And I would suggest that you make sure that you are familiar with them, you're familiar with the theory, you've highlighted your theory. There are certain sections or certain slides which will cover on the theory, which I feel is important for you guys to know. So, that will help a bit with your highlighting. But please make sure that you do understand which statements are relevant. Don't just study a topic for the sake of studying a topic. Understand where the theory is coming from and how all of this integrates as well. And once you start doing that, and once you start thinking along these lines, you'll start seeing that answering questions and scoring marks will start getting easier and easier and easier, right? Okay, so moving on, right? Okay, so this is the first question, right? What is internal control, right? So yes, this is a term that's often used but not quite understood, but that's not the answer that we're looking for, right? But with that being said, a lot of people do speak about internal control. And if you are busy with your articles, or if you've completed your articles, or even if you're working, you would have come across this term, because it is a very important term, and it's a term which people really use, but how many people really quite understand what internal control is? So we've got this term internal control, but what is internal control? So the definition from ISA 315 revised is that internal control is the process designed, implemented, and maintained by those charged with governance, management, and other personnel to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of an entity's objectives with regard to the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness, and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The term controls refers to any aspects of one or more of the components of internal control. Okay, so that definition is quite a mouthful, and just reading it doesn't really give you a lot. it's maybe not really giving you the clarity which you want. So you really need to break it down, and that's why I've highlighted it, right? So if you see in yellow, I've highlighted charged with governance, management, and other personnel. That is sort of focusing your attention on who is responsible for internal control, right? And as you can see, that it's going to be those charged with governance, management, and other personnel within the organization, right? Another thing to point out is that it says reasonable assurance, right? Not absolute assurance. And the reason that we're looking at reasonable assurance is that internal control does have some inherent limitations, which we will touch on later in the webinar. And due to these inherent limitations, there is only reasonable assurance that it can provide an entity with regards to its control objectives, right? So that is something which is important for you to know, right? You don't want to be getting it mixed up and thinking that internal control is something that's going to result in absolute assurance. And it's surprising, but there are people who have gotten confused with that, or there are people who might not have actually known that reasonable assurance is relevant over here. So if you didn't know that, you know that now, and make sure that you do remember it. Another thing to point out is compliance with applicable laws and regulations, right? So obviously, any business, no matter what industry you're in, there will be laws and regulations which you need to follow, right? So obviously, non-compliance with these laws and regulations is not in the best interest of the company. I mean, not at all. And in some cases, it might even threaten the going concern of that company, right? Especially where the industry is very much regulated, and non-compliance would really result in the entity no longer being able to function. So you do want to make sure that you understand that internal control does also look at the compliance with your applicable laws and regulations. It's not that it ignores that, right? So it's not just looking at finance and just drawing the line there, right? So at the bottom here, I've got a much simpler definition that internal control refers to the policies, procedures, and practices implemented by an organization in order to ensure the accuracy and integrity of its financial information, as well as its adherence to applicable laws and regulations. So the applicability to, or the adherence to laws and regulations, I've already explained that. Why have I highlighted your organization? Okay, the thing is, because we're very used to dealing with companies, we always think of everything as a company, right? But internal control isn't something which is specific to a company only. You can be a sole proprietor, but there would be some level of internal controls which you need to be having, right? Think about payments and authorization for payments, right? If you are a sole proprietor, are you going to give your staff the ability to make payments? I very much doubt that. I think you'd want to keep control of that. You'd probably want to have controls over your petty cash and things like that, right? Over your inventory, definitely. So internal control is something which is applicable no matter what the entity is. So whether it's a partnership, whether it's a sole proprietorship, whether it's a closed corporation, whether it's a company, internal control is relevant, and internal control does have a place in that organization, right? Then what is the role of internal control? Now, we all know that internal control is important, right? I mean, I've been harping on that, and it's something that a lot of people will actually emphasize a lot on, right? And this is with good reason, because internal control is very important, right? It's not some concept which was thought up just for the sake of it. It does have a very important place. But what is the role of internal control, right? And where does it fit into an organization? And why is there so much focus on internal control, especially if you really keep up to date with the Financial Times and the economic news and things like that, which you should be doing. You will notice that a lot of companies are looking a lot more closely at their internal controls. There is a lot more prominence being given to internal control. And even when it comes to external auditors, it's important, right? So why is this, right? It's, there has to be a reason for this, right? So looking at what ISA 315 has to say, right? Internal control is designed, implemented, and maintained to address the identified business risks that threaten the achievement of any of the entity's objectives that concerns, number one, the reliability of the entity's financial reporting, number two, the effectiveness and efficiency of its operations, and lastly, its compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So, that's not very difficult to understand. As you can see, internal control does have a very important role when it comes to reliable financial reporting, right? Obviously, if your controls are not sound, what does that have to say then about the integrity of your financial information? So, your financial statements then, how reliable are those? How much, trust can a person put in them? Any user, even the auditor. Surely, if you go to a client, if you an auditor, and the internal control environment is sound, you'd be happier. You'd consider the client to be less risky, surely. So, you know, as opposed to if this was a very risky client and the internal controls were just all over the place, or there was a very poor system of internal controls. The effectiveness and efficiency of operations, we'll touch more on that as well, but in a nutshell, it's just to make sure that there's order in their organization. You're not getting things like people not knowing who's responsible for what, and payments being authorized by the wrong people or not being authorized. There being no policies in place when it comes to decision making, like with regards to operations, obviously, or any HR practices, etc., etc. So it does somewhat form the backbone of an organization in a lot of ways. So it doesn't actually have an isolated place in an organization. It is an ongoing thing throughout the organization. It fits in everywhere, right? Something just as simple as doing recons and things to that effect. That's internal control. So it's not isolated to one particular area of the organization. It does run through the entire organization. So that's something which is very important for you to take note of. Then what are the components of internal control, right? So there are 5 components of internal control. This should be ringing some bells from your undergrad studies. But if it doesn't, well, then allow this to be a refresher and a reminder. And the one advantage which you have now in your postgrad compared to your undergrad is that you can actually use your books, and these components are in your ISA. So if you do, draw a blank somewhere and you can't remember one of them, then you will easily find them there, right? And it's not that you're going to get a question in your postgrad, which is like how it was in undergrad, where you might have to just list, what are the components of internal control. So there won't really be direct theory on these things, but you need to know what they are. It will give you a better understanding and allow you to see the bigger picture. And if you'll notice on the slide, I've said that the control activities are very important. And this this does hold particularly true, right? Because the control activities are, there are control activities which need to be found in any sound internal control system, right? So when you're looking at your business cycles, especially, you will always find that the internal controls will fall within these control activities. And these control activities can actually be found in ISA 315, paragraph A96. Right, I haven't indicated that on the slide, but you can actually find them there, right? And the activities relate to authorization, performance reviews, information processing, physical controls, and segregation of duties, right? So these are important because you will see that your controls do sort of revolve around these five areas, or these five activities. Right. Now, knowing these components is not enough, right? Each of these components can still be broken down into further detail. So obtaining an understanding of the detail is absolutely crucial when it comes to obtaining a more comprehensive and advanced understanding of internal control and its various components. Right. You need to know and understand both, these both during your academic studies as well as in practice. So these components of internal control and, what they can be broken down into, which you might want to call subcomponents of internal control. They're not just relevant to your studies. It's not just that, for the sake of you studying auditing, so because it's going to come up in a test, you need to know it. They're very, very relevant in practice as well. And when it comes to auditing, you do need to think in a very integrated manner, and you need to really, have a very broad sense of thinking. So if you don't know what the, detail of all of these are, and then you are going to find that you're going to struggle, right? Whether it's in practice or whether it's in your tests and exams, you will find that you're not going to see the entire picture. So that is why it is important that you do go through the detail and that you do understand the detail in a more comprehensive manner, right? We don't go into detail with it now into this webinar, for the purposes of time and to really just focus more on the core aspects. But if you really want to give yourself a more advanced thing, then you would need to drill down a bit deeper. And we have actually prepared a study guide on internal control, which is specifically on internal control, because we feel that it is that important, right? And it's called the Student's Guide to Auditing Internal Control. All attendees to this webinar will get 50% off the normal retail selling price, and it's not yet available for publication, but it will be. But as an attendee to this webinar, like I've always mentioned in my previous webinars, we like to reward loyalty, and we will be giving you a discount for this. But as I've said before, we do take internal control very seriously. We don't consider it to be a random sort of topic. It's something which I feel needs to be given more prominence to, and I think that as a student as well, you do need to make sure that your knowledge of internal controls are up to scratch. Okay, moving on. What are the two types of internal controls which can be implemented in an organization? Right. Now, this might be ringing a few bells to some of you guys, and I really hope that it is. But in case it isn't, right, you get two types of internal controls. Internal controls can be broken up into two categories, basically, right? The first category are your preventative controls, and the second category are your detective controls, right? So what is the difference between the two? Right, so preventative controls are controls which are designed to prevent misstatements due to fraud or error before they occur. Okay, so these are the controls which an organization will put in place to make sure that a misstatement due to fraud or error does not occur. So something like that would be like an access control, right? If an organization doesn't want its staff using its assets, or wants to prevent the unauthorized use of its assets, rather, then obviously it would have certain access controls over the room or location where the assets are stored, right? So that's a preventative control, right? Because it's preventing the fraud or the error from happening, right? So, and that's what it's designed to do, right? But there are, people always like to take chances and to get around things, and some people manage to bypass or circumvent controls, and this is where your detective controls now kick in. So sort of like a plan B, sort of an extra layer of controls. And these are controls which are designed to detect misstatements due to fraud or error after they have occurred. So this would be something like a recon, right? Because you're doing a recon to check and to make sure that there haven't been any errors, everything balances, and if there are reconciling items, you can actually then follow up with them. So that is pretty much your detective controls, right? That is what they are looking at. And that's pretty much all you really need to understand. If you can understand the concept of it, you don't need to swat off laundry lists of what preventative controls are and what detective controls are. You just need to understand the concept, and that'll really be good enough to see you through and to ensure that you are able to identify the different controls. Right. Now, what are the 6 main internal control procedures or principles which every organization should implement? Right, so looking on the slide, you'll see that there are essentially 6 different controls or principles, as I've said, which are fundamental to ensure that an internal control system is operating effectively. All right, so you need access controls, and access controls, as you know, will prevent access to either, it can be an asset, it can be to the building itself, because you obviously wouldn't want unauthorized access to your building. I mean, people could make use of your resources without having the authorization to do so. They could make use of your facilities without having the authorization to do so. You've got your information now, which could be at risk because, someone who's not supposed to be there is there, that sort of thing. Authorization and approval, things like payments, ordering stock. Shouldn't these things be authorized? I mean, you don't want them just being done on the fly or, without any sort of control. Segregation of duties, obviously, to make sure that one person doesn't do 2 things. So it sort of makes it more difficult for fraud to happen, because obviously, there are separate functions within the system which are being performed by separate by different individuals. So it's not like one individual can actually defraud the system and just get away with it. Physical counts and verifications, these are your normal asset counts, your inventory counts, right? Nothing too technical about that. It's just basically doing a physical verification of the stock or the assets that you have. Periodic reconciliations, these are things like a bank recons, it can be a debtors recon, a creditors recon, and that's just to make sure that your balances are correct and that any reconciling items are identified and followed up. right? And standardized documentation. This is to ensure that the risk of error is minimized. So you don't want to have your organization working in such a way where all your forms are just completely different. So you've got your petty cash requisitions and there's just, there's no pre-printed form which has a certain way of looking. It's just, all over the place and people fill in on the form what they want. Also, not just within the one type of form, but you can also look at it between your other areas or other departments within your organization. There's certain minimum information which you might want every form to have, right? Something simple like the date, for example, or the signature space for the signature, name of a reviewer, name of an approver, name of a preparer, those sort of things. So certain things you'd want to make sure are on every form to firstly, yes, reduce the risk of error, and to secondly, also make sure that important details are not left out. You don't want to be putting yourself in a position where you've got important details, but they've just been left out, and now you don't have adequate supporting documentation for your transactions. Right, that's the last thing that you want to really be putting yourself in as an organization, right? Now we come to the limitations of internal control. Okay, and I did point out that internal control does not provide management with absolute assurance that the organization's control objectives will be met. And the reason for this is because there are certain inherent limitations which internal control has, which we will have a look at now. Okay, so firstly, management override. So management override is essentially where a member of management might decide to override a control requirement for his or her own personal gain if they have the authority to do so. So, for example, if someone has the authority to make payments, they may decide, I can override this thing. I don't need a second person to come and sign. I can make payments. I don't need to wait for anyone, and then just order stock for himself, for example, or fill out a requisition for stock by himself, and it might actually be for personal purposes, right? So the control could be there, but this guy can actually override it, and instead of sticking to it, he decides to abuse the system, I guess, and abuse his power and just override the control. Collusion, this is also a very common issue, where two employees might decide to work together in order to circumvent the system. So this can be a case of where two employees decide, now we're going to steal stock. So they decide, okay, they'll go tell the driver, okay, you know what? I'm going to give you, instead of 10 items of inventory, I'm going to give you 13 items of inventory, right? And we'll split the difference between us. We'll go and sell it somewhere. So the driver's like, okay, tell that to the stock controller. They'll agree with the person at the gate who should check the stock that's going out. And but now since they're all on the same page, even though he can see an issue, he's not going to say that there's an issue, because now they've decided now they're gonna make a bit of a profit from this. Unfortunately, that is something which is very real in organizations, and it is somewhere where internal control can't really assist, because collusion is basically where the control is being circumvented by two or more employees, right? I said two employees, but it can be two or more employees. And then human error, right? We're all humans, we all make mistakes. So a person could make a mistake, either by being in a hurry or due to negligence, or maybe they just don't understand the system properly. And that actually is something which you need to consider. There are cases of where an employee might not have a proper understanding of his function or the system that he's working with and actually start making errors. And that's scary, but it is actually a real consideration which people need to have, because what if your employee or an employee within the organization, and especially, when we are auditors, we know when we go to an entity or to a client, we feel like, this person doesn't quite know what they're doing, or they might not properly understand their system. And sometimes it's said in jest, I guess, or sometimes it's more serious, where you really feel that the person's in charge of this component, but do they really understand what they are doing? So that's actually something where internal control can't really do anything then, because it might not be that the person's being malicious, but they just might not understand, and it ends up resulting in the same problem, where a control doesn't get applied properly or doesn't get implemented properly, and problems then follow. Okay, so moving on, we are going to have a look at the advantages of internal control. So internal control does have a lot of advantages, as you will see on this page. I'm not going to read each and every one of them out, but it is a concept, or internal control is something which does benefit an organization, right? So if you really think about it, right, it does enhance the efficiency with which the organization is run, because there is somewhat more system and structure to the way things are carried out. That, for example, if there are reorder levels, for inventory, then, once the inventory levels reach that point, we need to then order more inventory, and there's a process for that as well. And, there's order and structure. It also ensures that adequate supporting documentation is created and maintained. So obviously, we want this. This is important, not just because, from our perspective as the external auditor, but even from the client's perspective. Because if they want to follow up on their own internal investigations or on a finding, how are they going to do it if there isn't any adequate supporting documentation? So they need to make sure that, they are in a position to maintain proper authorized documents for any of their transactions and their payments and so on and so forth. So that it also reduces the risk of fraud and misappropriation of assets occurring. And that's what pretty much ties down into these two, right? It reduces the risk of misstatements due to fraud or error, because there's somewhat more control and governance over what is happening in the organization. So it's one thing in terms of a behavioral thing, where there is somewhat more of a culture of, hey, there are rules and we've got to follow it. But there are processes and procedures which are in place to already detect and prevent fraud or error. So it does, from the auditor's perspective, make things a bit easier as well. And also for the entity, right? And it also helps reduce the risk of misuse or misappropriation of company resources. And this can be like assets, right? So you don't want to arrive at a situation where you're an entity, but your clients are using your assets for personal and private purposes. You need to be controlling that, because if you're not, your company's costs are going to really skyrocket, and they're not even on things which are benefiting you as the organization. They're not even things which are generating you profit. They just basically your employees using your resources for their own benefit. And those are things which you do want to keep an eye on. And with all of this, I mean, it may reduce the amount of work to be done by the external auditors, which could result in reduced audit fees. Because if you are seen to be less risky, remember what we said on our previous webinar on materiality. If you are less risky, it is highly likely that then your materiality figure would increase. And with that, you could end up seeing that as an auditor, you will test smaller sample sizes. And that would obviously take time out, so you wouldn't audit for as long as you need to, and the audit fee would obviously then also be reduced, right? So there are obviously a lot more benefits. I haven't gone through each one. This is not a complete list, but if you do want to know more, then you will find a lot more in the Student's Guide to Auditing Internal Control. As I said, attendees to this webinar will get a 50% discount for this textbook, right? Now, the disadvantages of internal control, right? So, with it being true that internal control does have its advantages, there are some disadvantages which it does have. Firstly, if the system of controls is too rigid, it might cause the organization to be run less effectively. This is basically where, if you're trying to order stock, but you haven't made, any room for, okay, fine, if the stock controller is not there, then what do we do in instance, of a person being absent or a person being ill and unable to sign, things like this, because you could end up really putting your organization at a bit of a halt. So there does need to be certain instances where you need to say, okay, fine, if person A is always authorizing a certain thing, but they are not there, then, have something in place for that. So you have to, accommodate for things like this, right? Employee frustration could increase. This is because of, look, if employees can't get their work done, so now they need someone to sign their acquisition form, for example, that person's not there, now they can't get on with their work. It's really frustrating, right? And if you are working, you might have experienced that yourself. It's not nice, but that's generally one of the disadvantages which internal control does have if it's not implemented properly, right? And here, if not properly executed, it could result in overstaffing. And this is like where if segregation of duties is not controlled, you could just end up appointing staff members where you don't need to be appointing staff members. And that's not what you want. You don't want to just be hiring people for the sake of hiring people. You need to hire people, obviously, for the function that is necessary for them to perform. And you need to make sure that there is a need for that function and that it is actually necessary that, a certain function is performed by two different people. So, for example, a person can't prepare and review something, right? So in an instance like that, you would need two separate people, right? So that's why you need to make sure that you do carry out your internal control implementation properly, or as an entity that they carry out their internal control properly. And as I said, there are more examples in a Student's Guide to Auditing Internal Control. There is a lot more detail there, so I really would advise that if you really want to take your studies of internal control to the next level, that you do actually grab a copy of this book when it becomes available. Now, looking at ISA 265, and this should be an ISA which you all definitely should be familiar with, right? And it deals with the auditor's responsibility to communicate with those charged with governance and management regarding deficiencies in internal control, which the auditor has identified during the audit, and which in the auditor's opinion, or rather their professional judgments, are of sufficient importance to merit their respective attention. Okay, so the auditor does have a responsibility to report significant deficiencies in internal control to management or those charged with governance, right? And there is a difference between a deficiency in internal control and a significant deficiency in internal control, right? So it is important that you know the difference, right? And how you will actually go about this is covered in more detail in ISA 265. It is a short standard, but it's very important, and a lot of students really squiz through it. So we are going to have a detailed webinar on it because it is an important section. It is one which students do generally fly over, but I really feel that students do need to be putting a lot more focus and attention on the section and giving it the time which it really does deserve. It's not a very difficult section, but obviously if you haven't covered it as well as you would have liked to, then or as well as you should have, it is going to be an issue and a problem. So there will be a detailed webinar that will be held on that, and I suggest that you just keep an eye out for that webinar. Right? Okay, next. Okay, general controls and application controls, and this is a concept which is becoming more and more popular in auditing circles, right? And it's not difficult to understand why. So technology and computerized environments are becoming more and more common, right? And that is a fact which everyone knows, right? Manual environments are becoming phased out and computerized environments are becoming the norm. Controls therefore need to be in place for these computerized environments. So with a computerized environment, there are a lot of risks which are specific to the environment, but we obviously need to address these risks, right? And the way to do this is by implementing controls which will address these risks, right? And the principles for these are the same as those for a manual environment, right? It's only the way that the control is implemented that changes. So if you really think about it, right? What about access controls in a physical environment, right? So access controls in a physical environment might result in us needing an access card to access the building or something like that. But with a computer program, what type of access control would we have, right? So something like this would be a password, right? So do you see that the principle is still the same way? It's an access control. It's just how access is granted, which is changing because the environment is different, right? Controls also in a computerized environment consist of general controls as well as application controls, right? And it's important to note that these controls can be both manual and computerized. So just because you're working in a computerized environment doesn't only mean that the controls are automated and that there's no manual controls that are in or that would be relevant there. They are. So if you look at general controls are those policies and procedures which relate to many applications and support the effective functioning of application controls. So the term general controls really pretty much explains itself. And examples of these are program change controls, software acquisition controls, and access security controls. So if you really look at it, they're not specific to one particular application. They're very general, if I can really just use that term. They're not anything which are too difficult. They're actually one of the easier parts of computerized environments. So if you are a student and computerized environments is a section that is somewhat daunting for you, I would say don't stress on it too much in terms of, freaking out, right? Don't stress on it in that way, because general controls are one area in which you really can score marks, and it's not difficult at all, right? This set of slides obviously doesn't go into a lot of detail. There is another textbook which or a study guide which we've actually got specifically for general controls and application controls. But you will see once we actually work through this that it's not as much of a monster as what it's made out to be. Right. Now, application controls, these are somewhat more complicated. And a lot of students do generally struggle a bit more with this, right? So application controls refer to those controls which typically operate at a business process level and relate to the recording of transactions by the individual applicants. Application controls consist of both manual controls as well as automated or computerized controls. So a lot of the time, because of the word application, we get confused and think that, okay, it can only be computerized, right? Or it can only be automated because it's, an application control. So an application is something which is, relating to a computer, and therefore the controls can only be computerized. It's a mistake which a lot of students do make, but it's a mistake which you need to stop making now, right? Application controls do consist of both manual controls and computerized controls. And it is vital that you understand this and that you see this. Now, application controls relate mainly to the input processing, outputs, as well as master file maintenance controls. They also address the occurrence, completeness, accuracy, and authorization of a transaction. And if you do questions, you'll see this. They will ask for the application controls which should be in place over the occurrence and completeness of revenue, for example, right? You will find those sort of things, right? So it is important for you to know what application controls are addressing so that you can zone in on the controls and you can actually understand, what these controls are talking to. I always emphasize a lot on seeing the bigger picture, but trust me, this is something which you need to ensure that you do, because if you are missing out on the bigger picture here and you're not seeing where your application controls tie up into the whole scheme of things, you are going to struggle. And I think that's actually why a lot of students do struggle. Yeah. So looking at this slide, nothing really to study here. It's just emphasizing on the importance of your general controls and your application controls. Look, these controls are not going to go anywhere. You need to make sure that you study them. They are going to come out in your tests and exams. They are going to come out in your board exam. You're not going to avoid them. So if you're having issues with these, I would suggest that you actually take action and get it sorted out. And they really aren't as difficult as what a lot of people make them out to be. It's just that you have to know how. And because of this, we've actually gotten a detailed webinar on this section, which will follow, specifically on general controls and application controls. And if you are struggling with this topic, I highly advise that you attend this webinar. You will find it very beneficial, I can assure you that. In addition to that, we've also got a study guide, which is the Student's Guide to Auditing Advanced Computerized Information Systems and Environments. And this is also another very, very, very comprehensive guide, which we are particularly happy about, which will really, really help you when it comes to your general controls and application controls, and to really understand computerized information systems and your advanced computerized environments in a lot more detail, and to really understand it a lot better. We have noticed, that students generally struggle with this. And it's understandable because it's somewhat newish when it comes to the rest of the topics which you are studying, because a lot of the topics will deal very much on a manual system. There's no real computerization. If you look at preliminary engagement activities or risk assessment, for example, or your, legislative matters like your Companies Act and your CIPC and things like that, There's no computerization involved there. So, it's only now when it comes to the control part that you really start seeing that, the computerization is, making itself feel very apparent, and it feels very new. It feels very foreign. A lot of students try and breeze through it, but I can tell you now that's a mistake. In fact, as things go on, as time moves on, I personally think that general controls and application controls are going to become more and more and more relevant, especially if you consider the environment in which we are operating in and how everything is becoming automated and computerized. So you're not going to get away with not studying the section, and I wouldn't advise that you think along those lines, right? Of no, you'll get a surface understanding and just run away from the section and try and score marks in the other sections. It's not, these are not difficult. I promise you, you will see that we will show you that you can actually understand these sections, quite easily. In fact, I think that the problem is that not enough attention is given to them, and you might need a bit more focus on them. That's all. But once you've gotten that, you A4 basically. I mean, you'll know exactly how to address them and how to tackle the issue and how to actually understand and study these sections. Right. Now, exam technique. As I said, exam technique is very important, right? And it's going to make the difference between you passing and failing. So you can learn your work as well as you want. You can know your theory as well as you'd like. But if you don't have sound exam technique, then you are going to experience problems. So the starting point is to make sure that you know and understand your theory. And I mean, that goes without saying, right? If you don't know and understand your theory, then you can't really apply anything to the question, now can you? So that is your starting point, right? Make sure that your theory is up to scratch and that you know it well. Next, read the required properly, right? So does the question ask for strengths, or does it ask for both strengths and weaknesses? And it sounds like a very easy and straightforward and obvious point, but you'd be amazed at how many students have missed marks because they just haven't gone over the required properly and haven't addressed it. Does the question ask for recommendations, right? So this is commonly asked with weaknesses. You wouldn't just be asked to identify the weakness, they would want recommendations. And one of the biggest problems is that students cannot identify weaknesses. And I mean, I know how that feels, right? So you read the scenario and everything seems perfect. Everything seems like, no, this is a properly functioning system. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong here. And the reason that you'll feel that way is when your theory isn't quite where it needs to be. So I would advise that you really make sure that your theory is up to scratch, because once you've gotten your theory up to scratch, that's when you can actually apply something, and you've got a bit of a framework, if I can use that word, to really look at how to apply things. And doing questions does help, and I do advise that when it comes to internal controls, you do a lot of questions, because this will sort of help you understand what are common weaknesses that might be tested, how to identify weaknesses, and what a system should look like, right? Recommendations effectively will be the internal controls which should be present in the system which are currently absent. So they're not difficult to really think up your recommendations. If you know how a properly functioning internal control system for the particular business cycle should be, then it's easy. And the same thing would apply with whether it's manual or computerized. It's not really going to make a difference either way. as long as you know what controls should be in place in an ideal system, the moment these controls are missing, you would be able to sort of pick these up. Now, speaking of computerized controls, a good technique is to relate the question to something which you would have encountered in real life. And this was a technique which a lot of students do use, and something which I've also used, because it just makes it feel a lot easier to relate to. Because let's say you are booking a ticket on an airline and you are asked to discuss the controls which should be in place in respect of booking the tickets with the customers. Then think about the process that you would go through to make, when you are booking a ticket, right? And this will give you a better understanding of the system, because think about it, when you're reading the system, you're there in the exam venue, you're reading through the scenario, and it's just a system on paper, right? You're not seeing it. Sometimes, another technique would be to actually draw the system out, but if you can relate to the system as something in real life, that will help a huge amount. That will really be a lot easier for you to then see the bigger picture, right? So I would highly advise that you do this. Also understand which controls in a computerized system are relevant to a particular control activity or assertion. So for example, with access controls, right? In a computerized environment, a password is a type of access control. So you need to make sure that which controls are relevant to what, and that will really help you. So obviously, a password isn't the only access control which you can implement, but these are along the lines which you need to think, right? And these are going to be discussed in a lot more detail in our study guide. So if you have any other questions, please do contact us via our Facebook page, and we will get back to you. We will respond. We enjoy hearing from you guys. We actually get some really good queries, and we would really like hearing from you guys, and we encourage you, please, send us your queries, get in touch with us, contact us. As we said, we created this webinar for you guys to learn, and we even created this perk, for you guys, because we want you guys to learn. So please don't miss out on this. Make sure that you take advantage of this, and do speak to us if you are struggling with something. And for a free sample of our study guides, please email us at marketing@caquadrantacademy.com. This is pretty much your bonus, is your discount. As I said, that you will get a 50% discount on the cost of these guides. So please make sure that you do take advantage of this. You will find these guides to be very useful. And we've taken the approach that if you guys have registered for this webinar, it shows that you want to learn. And we don't feel that we should prevent anyone who is showing initiative and who is showing the effort of improving themselves and improving their knowledge. We don't feel that we should make it harder for them to study. We feel we should actually make it easier for them to study. So please, by all means, if you need to get into contact with us, do so. If you want a free sample of the guides, please, once they are available, we will give you a free sample. And as I said, for attending this webinar, you will get a 50% discount, right? So that's it for the webinar. There's not much else that we can really say. But yeah, it's been quite a lengthy webinar, and it's just something that shows you that internal control is not one section which you're just going to walk over. You do need to know it. But with that said, your knowledge of it should be a lot greater than what it was before you watched this webinar. I really hope that it is. And make sure that you do keep in contact with us if you do struggle with any other aspect. We will have other webinars coming out. We will have other study guides coming out. So please make sure that you do keep your eye out for those, and that you continue your learning, and that you do turn the CTA year around if it's not going the way that you wanted it to go. So if your academic year isn't quite where you want it to be, don't worry, we are here to try and help you and to make sure that you do succeed come year end. That's it for the webinar, and thank you very much.